been a while since I've taken you behind the scenes at the Scottish Parliament to see what goes on in those committee rooms. But we're going to go and have a look at the Equality and Human Rights Committee and their discussion of the smacking ban. Now, a substantial majority of adults in Scotland disagree with the smacking ban. But this committee has invited people to give evidence. They've invited 11 people who agree with it and one person who disagrees. So basically, the people giving evidence, I mean, they're just stuff full of people from government-funded organisations who are just going to toe the party line. But then also there's Dr. Stuart Waiton, who I assume was invited by some sort of clerical error. The Be Reasonable campaign, which is an organisation campaigning against the smacking ban in Scotland, the only one doing that as far as I'm aware, was not invited. They made a submission, but I think that is outrageous that they should be ignored as the single organised voice against the smacking ban. So we're now going to watch part of Stuart Waiton's appearance before a Holyrood committee, and I think we can safely assume it will be his last appearance.
I think this is a tragic, depressing bill, and yet another one which appears to represent the aloof, elitist nature of politics and professional life that treats parents in a very patronising and degraded way, uses all sorts of weird legalistic talk about violence, equating children with adults. That makes no sense at all to ordinary people, and criminalises parents, despite, again, people trying to claim that it doesn't. People talk about all the evidence proves that any level of smacking to children damages them, is absolutely untrue and the opposite of the truth. But I presume I'm just wasting my time because this bill has already passed.
Well, the bill certainly will pass. I mean, this is the Scottish Parliament. What's the chance of a virtue signalling piece of legislation like that not passing? It's zero. So is Dr. Waiton wasting his time, or other campaigners wasting their time? Well, they're definitely not. Campaigning is important. You can influence public opinion. That's a very valuable thing to do. But ultimately, we're a democracy, so you can influence things so much from the sidelines, but ultimately, we need players on the pitch. We don't want to be trying to influence the MSPs from the outside. We want MSPs on the inside who can strongly argue the case for us. That's what the Scottish Family Party is all about. Now, human rights in the Scottish political establishment and in education are regarded as the ultimate moral authority. They're a religion substitute. Now, the contents of the rights themselves are fairly uncontroversial, but there are various human rights agencies at a European level, UN level, that interpret and elaborate on these rights, adding to them in ways that are unrelated to the straightforward content of the original text. Now, the smacking ban's been put before the Equality and Human Rights Committee. I mean, that's about the same as putting a rule on banning alcohol before the Iranian Islamic Consultative Assembly. In both cases, the sacred texts are clear, so end of debate.
Obviously, the UK has ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is very clear about this issue, and there is no ambiguity. So they have repeatedly stated that all physical punishment in all its forms should be prohibited by law.
Hang on a minute. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child does not clearly state that smacking kids is unacceptable. The UNHCR applies to under 18s. It says that they shouldn't face the death penalty, torture, life imprisonment. Now, she starts off by saying it states, the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child states, but then later on she said they state. By then she means the UN agency that's responsible for interpreting the UNCRC. Now, in signing up to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, it's not just that you're signing up to a particular body of text. You're signing up to however these agencies might decide to interpret them in the future. And I think that's undemocratic. You can't outsource moral reasoning and responsibility to the United Nations. Anyway, on we go.
Dr. Waiton, would you like to...
Well, I don't accept the concepts. I don't accept the people that are defining the concepts. The idea of children's rights is a bit of a nonsense concept. Children don't have rights. They don't have the same framework of rights as adults. They have protections, And essentially, when we talk about children's rights, what we are really talking about is the right of professionals to make decisions on their behalf. So it's a confused concept, goes against the framework of how we have historically thought about rights in terms of freedoms. So it's a problem. And the problem that we have with this bill is essentially a question of autonomy. You are undermining the autonomy of loving parents to decide how to raise their children with a sense of privacy and also a sense of support from society. And in the process, you are degrading something which is done as a form of discipline that should not be understood as a form of violence. And parents should be supported rather than undermined. So for me, this is a question of autonomy. And I think you have to question the whole framework of how we think about children's rights.
Before I bring in Professor Callahan there, can I just ask Dr. Waiton, I mean, that defence of autonomy used to apply to the physical punishment of women by their husbands. Would you suggest that that should be brought back?
No, because I don't look at adults and children as the same, unlike the people who are supporting this bill, who seem to look at adults and children the same and therefore degrade or confuse actions. So people here who defend the idea that adults and children should be treated the same in terms of violence, I assume see smacking a child and smacking a woman as the same thing, which I think is degrading to women because they are not the same thing. Adults and children are very different. We would not expect to ground our partners, refuse to let them leave the house. That would be seen as a criminal offence, whereas we ground our children, or perhaps in a few years' time, you will be making that criminal as well.
Now, I'm not wishing to criticise Dr. Waiton, but the question needs to be asked. Was it really wise to raise a point requiring intelligent engagement to understand in a Holyrood committee? I'm not sure it was. So he's saying the children don't have rights, they have protections. So effectively is asking the question, are rights the most appropriate way of encapsulating our duties towards children? Now that's quite an abstract academic point. I'd be inclined to agree with him, at least to some extent. There are issues that can be raised about the idea of children's rights. There are issues that can be raised about the idea of rights in general, about their validity and their value in a society. Now if you hear someone say, children don't have rights, I suppose there's two basic ways you could interpret it. One way is you could assume that they want children to be executed and tortured, and you could denounce them for it. Or number two, you could assume that they have a different theoretical framework about how to treat children, and you could explore that idea with them. Particularly if the person said children don't have rights but they have protections, that might help guide you to which of those is the correct interpretation. Right, which interpretation do they choose in this committee? Option 1.
Having done hundreds of interviews with children who've experienced domestic abuse, I would have to say that I can't agree that children are a different order of human being from adults, and I can't agree that they don't have personhood, that they don't have a capacity to reflect on their experiences, and that they aren't harmed by those experiences.
I mean, that's just a bit bizarre. Who is she disagreeing with? Dr. Waiton said nothing that could be remotely misconstrued as meaning anything like what she's claiming. I mean, this lady is a professor. You'd think she'd be capable of engaging with what someone's actually said instead of a series of straw men. But apparently not.
Yeah, I just find it shocking some of the arguments made before about children not having rights and not being subject to and having inherent rights and being treated as property or as wives were treated a century ago or slaves even. Yes, that's quite appalling.
So that gentleman's from the Scottish Human Rights Commission, not to be confused with the Equality and Human Rights Commission that your taxes also pay for. So your taxes are paying for this bloke to sit there spouting this sort of rubbish, suggesting that Dr. Waiton wants children treated like slaves. Now, parents exercise a considerable degree of control over children, way beyond what would be acceptable for an adult over another adult of sound mind. But why do they do that? They do that for the children's protection, in order to nurture them, to enable them to develop, to prepare them for adult life. In other words, they exercise this control for the children's own good. In slavery, this exercise is controlled for the master's benefit in order to get work out of them. Now, slavery has got all sorts of other negative connotations, but the heart of it is a removal of freedom to leave, to make your own decisions in some areas where adults usually can. So these people claim that they want children treating like adults. Really? So a parent's not going to have the duty to provide food, shelter and care for children in the same way they don't have it to provide for other adults. And what these human rights people do is they ignore what parents do for children and they focus on how they exert authority over children for the benefit of the children, and they seek to liberate them from their parents' authority. Now, if you liberate children from the parental authority, you also liberate them from parental care. If you undermine parental authority sufficiently, people ultimately won't want to have kids. It's a parallel to the situation in education. You undermine the authority of teachers to the point where people just don't want to be teachers anymore.
There's what you call advocacy research, which is people who've already made their minds up. And then there's research where you're actually trying to look at it. And as far as I can tell, Robert Lozellier actually tries to look at it. And he talks about there's been 9 studies that look at the overview of all the research, 7 of which do not come to the conclusion that smacking is harmful for children, particularly, as you say, backup smacking. And actually they come to the conclusion that backup smacking, which is something where it's not used as a first resort, it's not used as the only resort, actually ends up being the best form of discipline, where it's, generally speaking, you don't smack, but occasionally you might. And that, so the evidence, the idea that there is proof, there is evidence and all the rest of it, that a light form of smacking damages children, is just not borne out. And I would just plead to your common sense, right? I would plead to your common sense that if you think doing that to a small child is a form of violence that harms them, then you are living on another planet.
I have to question Dr. Waiton's tactics at this point again. Appealing to common sense in the Scottish Parliament? Anyway, since they live on another planet, I normally say it's a parallel universe. They think they live on a higher plane. Let's talk about research. I spoke about research into smacking quite a lot in my previous video, so I won't recap that. But another point to make about the research, it's obviously ideologically driven, and most sociology departments or whatever, they focus on researching the harms of smacking. If you keep doing research, and some of them will find a harm, some of them don't, the ones that do, keep them and publish them, the ones that don't, well, just forget about those ones. Research into the benefits of smacking, virtually no one does that, so there's not much around on that. Now, it's a fact in Scotland, disciplines fall into bits in schools. And might it not just help if kids learn obedience to parents before they go to school? Might smacking help in that process? Maybe it would. But that sort of logic, no place in the Scottish Parliament.
So in response to that, I mean, I attended a conference, Dr. Waiton, in 2007 on physical punishment of children. It was addressed by John Carnachan, who at that time, as a senior police officer, was head of the Strathclyde Violence Reduction Unit. He was there because he saw an empirical correlation between the use of physical punishment in the home and violence on the streets, because in his words, that any form of violence in the home used as a tool of sanction or in anger legitimise that as a tool of sanction or in anger between children and their peers as they grew up. Do you recognise that violence begets violence in that nature, in that case?
Well, I don't even accept that done to a 3, 4, 5-year-old child should be understood as violence. I think it's completely confused. I don't know. Why do you ask my daughter? She's over there. I smacked her occasionally as a child. Have you been violent recently? Are you going to beget violence? Yeah, and John Carnachan's really scientific. Yeah, that's right. I mean, you know, you just have to be honest with yourself. Do you think doing that to a 3, 4, 5-year-old child begets violence? Right? If you think it does, you really are on another planet. And
in 2003, the last time this Parliament legislated in this area, we brought down restrictions on physical punishment. Those restrictions were no shaking, no headshots, and no use of implements. That's it.
Headshots? What's he on about? I think he's been listening to too many kids playing Fortnite.
So anything below the neck, anything, you know, even perhaps to the point of pain and harm.
even to the point of pain. Well, pain is the point. With smacking, the concept of punishment involves artificially adding an undesirable consequence to an action, and in the case of smacking kids, the unpleasant aspect is pain. It hurts momentarily, and a lot of parents find that more effective than other means of discipline.
Is legitimate. So where do you get the suggestion that that is the sum total of the physical punishment that goes on in homes in Scotland?
Well, it wouldn't necessarily be the sum total, but you would be criminalising that. And as far as I understand it, reasonable chastisement is still there. And if you are unreasonable, you can be taken to court for that. You can be challenged for being unreasonable. And I think there's lots of people who would think if they saw a child being strongly beaten by their parent, they would think that was unreasonable and they would challenge that. So perhaps if you want to reword it to something else, then you could maybe go back and think about that. But at the minute, you will be criminalising somebody who smacks a child on the bottom or smacks their hand. That is what you will be doing.
But there are many parents in this room, all of whom can attest to the feeling of losing control when disciplining their children, whether that's the timeout or shouting, or even some people in this room maybe smacking as well. And I would suggest to you, sir, that, well, I would ask you, do you think that every family in this country who uses physical punishment always retains an element of control when they are deploying that physical punishment?
No. And nor do I think they should be, you would be helping that family by arresting them.
We're quite keen on this argument. What about parents who lose their temper, lose control? If they hit the kids, they're likely to hit them really hard. But on the other hand, think about it another way. Parents who smack their kids at a certain point when they decide enough's enough and bring the kids into the line, are they more or less likely to lose control? How about the parent who's trying to be all trendy, nicey, sent them to the naughty step for 3.5 minutes, talked it through, been around that cycle lots of times, it's not working, they're getting more and more frustrated? Who's more likely to lose control? The one who's letting the frustrations build up because they're not taking effective action, or the one who's nipped it in the bud and their children are well behaved?
Last night I asked my child why she is 6 years old, and I asked her why the parliament should prohibit hitting or smacking you, and she didn't talk about her. She said it's because he sends them. She said because it's bad, and I say, what do you mean by it's bad? It's because that means that if you hit me, I can go and I can hit another people.
Enter the Conservatives. Most Conservative MSPs oppose the smacking ban, apparently, but the party doesn't, and it won't be in their manifesto to repeal it at the next election either, I would suggest. So first up we have Oliver Mundell MSP, who happens to be the son of David Mundell, the MP, and here he is asking questions that people can't understand because they make no sense. I don't want to be unduly unkind, just watch this and judge for yourself.
Thank you, Convener. I wondered if the panel were able to say whether or not they ever thought it was acceptable to use physical force to regulate or manage behaviour.
About managing behavior, I don't think it's acceptable. So I don't know whether you are talking about restraint if you need to, I don't know, make sure that a child doesn't come to harm.
So in that case, do you think that parents are responsible for the safety and well-being of their children?
Yes.
So who's responsible for my safety and well-being? I'm over the age of 18. Who's responsible for my safety and well-being?
You appear to be blurring the boundaries around protection from harm and you know, sort of other kinds of children's rights there, and I'm not sure that it's defensible logically.
Well, I'm trying to draw out what I think is a nuanced point around where this legislation could go wrong. For example, where parents have to physically restrain their children for their own safety. We saw an example of that worked through by children themselves in Kirkcaldy this week at a YMCA group, where they had a young child running across the road repeatedly to try and get to a Mr Whippy ice cream van. And in that particular circumstance, children thought it maybe wasn't the best thing to do to hit the child, but they could see how, in order to prevent that incident from happening, that it would be better to be smacked than to be hit by a car. I'm thinking of parents who have to manage very difficult behaviour in their children. It might be better than letting that behaviour escalate. And that's what I've heard, certainly from at least some children. It's what I hear from some families, families I have to deal with in my constituency work. So by asking these questions, I'm just trying to draw out if there's a distinction between certain uses of physical force and a use of physical punishment. But I didn't come in with a preconceived view.
I'm not sure why it would be necessary to hit a child in that circumstance.
But can you understand why it might come about?
I can understand why it can come about, but I don't really see how it's a defence for hitting a child. Holding a child back, certainly, but hitting a child, how will that stop them from running in front of a car? It's not a logical consequence of the child running in front of the car. The two things are not connected.
So I guess I'd just go back and say, in the context of our criminal justice system as it exists at the moment, where families do end up having to use the current defence in court, do you think that's a positive experience for those families?
That's just a really stupid question. If you live in Dumfriesshire and you voted Conservative, that's the MSP who's representing you. Anyway, moving on with the Conservative Party MSPs, on to Annie Wells.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, panel. I've went out and visited a church in Glasgow, and having looked at the public opinion that we've seen in various polls, YouGov panel base and ComRes polls from 2017, 2018, we don't have the public's support on this bill. Now, I think as parliamentarians, and as this parliament tries to do, we try to represent the people that elected us to be here, and that is representing public opinion. So how would you suggest that we can bring the public on this journey with us?
Some Conservative MSPs oppose the smacking ban, but you can see here that Annie Wells is actually against smacking. She wants it to be eliminated. She classes herself as part of the we who are trying to eradicate smacking in Scotland. So she's against the ban now, but only because the public is as yet insufficiently enlightened to back a smacking ban. This is why Scottish politics is a one-way street in the progressive direction. This sort of enfeebled and unprincipled opposition. She won't challenge the idea at the heart of the policy. She just tries to go in the same direction, go with the flow, but just a step or two behind. Right, next up, Conservative MSP Gordon Lyndhurst, who's also got some very strange questions to ask.
Do you see parents' rights or children's rights as one being more important than the other? And that's the first question.
So in terms of, I think we already talked about this earlier, in terms of international human rights law, it's very clear that the best interest of the child needs to be a priority.
Who then should decide for the parents of the children? Is it not just saying it's people out with the family who will decide instead of the parents and children?
So get his overall point there, the state shouldn't interfere in family life. Then he seems to be saying parents and children should decide for themselves what punishments should be. Could you imagine the conversation? Mum and Dad say to Freddie, so what would you prefer, a smack or the naughty step? I think I'll go for the naughty step, please. How long do you think? Your mum thinks 7 minutes, I think 10 minutes. How long do you think? Oh, I think 1 minute should do it, Dad.
And I would like to ask how you can differentiate between the upset that a child feels from being grounded for a week, for example, compared to having their bottom or hand smacked. Because I cannot see how in the future, if you're going to be logically consistent, you will not eventually say that that should be banned as well. Because the level of vulnerability that you understand children to have is so high, and their lack of resilience is so profound, that I can't see how this can't eventually, in 5-10 years' time, end up problematizing almost any form of discipline whatsoever.
Absolutely correct. And if you think that's scaremongering, bear in mind the fact that the Scottish Government is in the process of eliminating all punishments from Scottish schools.
People who are against smacking think that they're progressive and they don't like the idea that they are criminalising people. But can we just clarify, when you pass a law, we make something criminal. Right? And therefore, smacking your child will be a criminal offence. Okay? Every single parent might not end up being locked up for 5 years, but we will, and Professor Callaghan is supporting the criminalisation of smacking. So you are supporting that child who is being smacked on the bottom because they're going to run across the road by that parent. You are supporting that becoming a crime.
Thank you. I think we're all clear on what we're doing here.
In other words, don't be so silly, Dr. Waiton. Of course we all agree that we're criminalising a behaviour.
We are not criminalising a conduct. What we are doing is to remove a defence, to treat children equally than other groups. So that's quite an important and significant difference. So we are not criminalising.
One of my concerns is the confusion, again, we seem to have. So we seem to say, yes, we accept we're criminalising. And then we say, well, you know, we'll kind of be sensible. And if there's trivial, as you said, trivial physical punishment. I don't think we talk about trivial physical punishment if we were talking about domestic violence, right, to a woman. Right? But when we're talking about children, we say, well, if it's just trivial and it's different. So we do appear to be treating children and adults differently. So at least can we accept that, right? Because this is one of the arguments that we treat them differently. And to come back to the point about, I mean, is it legitimate to use the law to change attitudes? I think when you go to parents and essentially say, when you smack your child, you're on the trail towards child abuse, they will look at you with horror and disgust and think you're living on another planet and think that you are contemptuous of them, who have, many of whom will have smacked their children and love their children and would never abuse their children. And live amongst other people who do likewise, and know that that is not actually the reality for the vast majority of people who do not abuse their children. Unfortunately, that really degraded view of people seems to be what underpins what appears on the surface to be a progressive approach to things, is actually a very anti-human, negative, patronising and elitist outlook about ordinary parents who smack their children, love their children and would never abuse their children.
A hysterical language that demonises parents who smack their kids is the backbone of the smacking ban campaign. Listen to these 3 little examples of that.
Assaulting a child for the purpose of punishment should never be legal and is at odds with the values that we hold in Scotland. The Convention on the Rights of the Child is very clear that children should grow up in a family environment of happiness and love and understanding.
We strongly support the aims of the bill as well, both as a means of realising children's rights to dignity and bodily integrity, as well as their rights to health, development and education, and as a means of reducing violence in families and society.
Thank you.
That what we're talking about here is assault, and so that's a deliberate attack on another person for the purpose with an evil intent, which is, so the intention is to cause physical injury or fear of personal injury, and so that's something that is prescribed by law, unless you're the parent or carer of a child and you're doing it for the purpose of punishment.
In case you're wondering who the bloke is who's been so grossly and gratuitously offensive to most parents in Scotland, he is the Children and Young People's Commissioner, who gets paid a handsome sum out of your taxes.
Absolutely essential, and this is about how the state can support parents and families to ensure that children can access all of their rights.
Just remember that the next time you hear about the named person scheme or whatever, being there to support parents. Their idea of supporting parents? Criminalising ordinary parenting. And we now return to Lib Dem MSP Alex Cole-Hamilton as he reaches peak smugness.
And some quite reasonable people in this debate are suggesting that physical punishment is actually sometimes in the best interests of the child. For example, if your child is about to put its hand in a fire or run into traffic. In the 54 countries in the world where this has already been abolished, have we seen a decline in children's welfare in terms of people not being able to restrain their children in that way?
There's absolutely not been any evidence of increased prosecutions. I can't attest to there being an increased incidence of children being knocked down or electrocuted or anything like that.
I think the child running into the road argument is weak. If it's talking about a single incident, I mean, smacking a child as they're about to run out in front of a car isn't a very helpful scenario. On the other hand, on the longer term, obedient kids are safer. Sometimes you might see a kid heading towards a road and you'll say, stop. If the child is used to doing as they're told, they probably will. If they're used to ignoring their parents and carrying on, because you've got 3 more chances and who cares, you only end up on the naughty step, maybe they will be in greater danger. Anyway, how is anyone going to measure whether obedient kids are safer? Is anyone going to do that research? Probably not. But you don't need to, because it's obvious. Okay, you go to school and they say, here's a rule, you don't climb on the roof. Who's safer, the obedient or the disobedient? You go into the science class. There are some safety rules. Who's safer, the obedient or the disobedient? When parents say to the kid, don't take drugs, who's safer, the obedient child or the child who's in the habit of being disobedient? The answer is obvious. As children have tended in general to become more disobedient, are teachers safe? Look at the appalling stats on attacks on teachers. Are kids safe from each other? What happens when kids who are in the habit of ignoring rules grow up? How do they behave? Are they a danger to other people? Of course they are. What happens when they get a car and ignore the rules relating to driving? Now, you can only get away with that sort of puerile argument because this is the Scottish Parliament and there's no one there to shoot it down.
I think fundamentally most parents really want to do what's best for their child and what's best for their family, but they also don't have the time to sit and read Equally Protected or Dr. Heilman's work. So there's a job of work around making that accessible for parents and sharing what we've learned.
So there we have the attitude at the heart of the Scottish Government with regard to parents. They think we're the experts, parents are well-meaning, bumbling amateurs. We need to educate you in our expertise so that you can bring up your kids properly. And if you don't follow our advice, we will support you by ultimately taking your kids off you and sending you to prison. I'll just finish with a quote. This is from the Children's First charity, who are obviously against the smacking ban that the government funded. And this father talks about his frustration when the kids are home, tempers flare trying to get them to do their homework. The thought crossed my mind that maybe if there'd been a bit more discipline, maybe tempers wouldn't be flaring, maybe things would be a little bit more orderly. But anyway, it goes on to say this. In past generations, the traditional role of a father was the disciplinarian, dispensing the physical punishment that teaches children a lesson. Then explains that this is now obsolete. Now, fatherlessness corresponds with a host of negative outcomes, including behaviour problems and criminality. Might it just be that the father as a disciplinarian figure is the way it's meant to be, whether you believe in smacking or not? That maybe that is an important function of the father. The trend these days, I think, is to try to turn dads into mums. The ideal dad is the one who acts most like a typical mum. But I digress. But what I've been showing you in this video is a glimpse inside the Parliament at the pitiful standard of debate. And you've seen it livened up at some points by Stuart Waiton. It only takes one clear, bold voice to totally change the atmosphere and totally change the discussion. And Stuart Waiton grabbed all the headlines after that committee meetings. The other sessions without him were just virtue signalling conventions and went unreported. To be honest, I can't imagine them inviting Stuart Waiton again because they can control who comes to the committee. Or can they? Maybe not entirely. There is another way of putting people in those committee rooms. In May 2021, you can go along to your local polling station and tick a box to choose an MSP. And if you want to put some strong opposition in there, into the Equality and Human Rights Committee, into the Parliament as a whole, vote for the Scottish Family Party. In the meantime, do subscribe to the YouTube channel, do join the party or a political party, there's a link below, you could join us, and thanks for watching.